these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. We have a fantastic guest with us today, Governor Scott Walker. You know, he's on the front lines here. A lot of people are on the front lines when it comes to conservative values, but not enough are on the front lines when it comes to presenting conservative values and arguments to young people, especially on college campuses. So, YAF, you're the current president of YAF, and it's a fantastic organization founded by William F. Buckley in like 1960.
Yeah, you got it.
I think one of our oldest, if not the oldest, youth foundation to promote conservatism. Thanks for being with us today, man. We got a lot of topics to cover that I think are interesting for anyone who studies civics, who's interested in politics. From your time in Wisconsin, your time getting into politics at a very young age, your time as governor, running for president, and then taking over YAF. Give everybody your elevator pitch on YAF real quick, just so we kind of start with that. Yeah. I love promoting it. It's one of my favorite organizations. So just give us, but I want to hear from you.
First, I should say we appreciate you not only having me on, but thank you for speaking at our conferences and speaking on campus. You just spoke for us.
I love it.
Just at Catholic University. You've been in Texas, all over the place for us, so thank you. It's simple. What Young America's Foundation does is train the next generation of leaders in the fight for freedom. Mm-hmm. Now we do it, as you mentioned, on college campuses, high schools, even middle school students now. We have conferences and events and programs, and eventually, in the not too distant future, we're going to start helping parents even of elementary school students, because the left, as you well know, is the radical indoctrination is starting younger and younger and younger, and we got to counter that.
Yeah, it does. It's disappointing because I don't know what your experience was growing up, but mine, I graduated high school in 2002. A little bit different high school experience. I was abroad, so it was kind of obvious that politics wouldn't be involved in my school. But I think if I was in the U.S., it would have been a similar experience. There wasn't much politics in our schools. Right. Kids just didn't think that way. They weren't on social media, so it wasn't presented right in front of their face. I went to a very liberal college, Tufts University, but it wasn't obvious to me how liberal it was, right? It wasn't in my face. I could just take my classes and live my life. And, and this is in the George Bush era. I mean, this is a divisive political era. We're going to war, we're doing all this stuff. And even then, I never felt like I just was constantly under attack. Now, to be fair too, I wasn't very political. Yeah. Right? I just wanted to go to the military. That's all I wanted to do. So I didn't care. But college kids now have a very different experience. High school kids have a very different experience. Middle school kids have a very different experience. Right. That's not a question, but it is a comment. And what do you hear from your students and your organizations?
Sure. What's interesting is I don't think fundamentally at their core, students, young people are that much different. I think the influences have dramatically changed. I have two sons who are 28 and 27. It's even been in their case a few years since they were in college. One at a Jesuit institution, Marquette University, Milwaukee. The other, the University of Wisconsin, obviously a public institution. They're both liberal institutions, but the last couple years have just been like a cliff in terms of dropping off and how radicalized things have gotten, how they're just, as you know, there's not even any free speech. I think back, just as an example, you mentioned 2001. So after 9/11, Young America's Foundation started a very simple project on campus. It's been going for now 20 plus years. It was this idea of putting up 2,977 American flags to represent each of the innocents' lives lost that day. Early on, even the college Democrats helped Young America's Foundation, CRs and others. The last couple of years, we've literally had pushback, if you can imagine, for the most simplest of activities on campus. We even had a student caught on camera, a member of the Student Senate at University in St. Louis, who in the middle of the night tore out all the flags, ripped them up, tore them up, and put them in the garbage. I mean, what's the deal with that?
What ideology is driving that? That's
well,
such
in his mind, he was like
extreme
imperialism. He thinks it's just, you've got such hatred out there. Yeonmi Park, the defector from North Korea, who now speaks for us on campus, I think what really drew her into the movement was she went to Colombia after escaping communist North Korea, making it through China, making her way here. She goes to Colombia and she hears after a couple weeks in the class, she's like, what the hell? These people hate America. What is wrong with you people?
Complete lack of perspective, complete ignorance of history. By the way, those same people who are, the left tears down the flag because of, like you said, imperialists, like that imperial hubris, which is a very common kind of left-wing narrative of our own history. It's a sort of self-deprecating narrative of American history. That's also pretty damn popular on the populist right? When I'm looking at all the people who are upset that Tucker Carlson is gone, they're like, the globalists won, the imperialists won. I'm like, are you 60s hippies? Who are you? Obviously, I shed 0 tears for Tucker Carlson. I have personal reasons for hating that guy. He said terrible things about me just on a very personal level. So I say that pretty openly. I'm not asking you to comment on that, but I am concerned that left-wing narrative, that anti-American narrative has made its way in some capacity onto the far right. Now they wear a red jersey and they're pro-life and they're pro-gun, right? They agree with us on a lot of things, but they don't actually like America. That's actually, they love the flag. It's weird. It's interesting. And is it new? It's kind of new. I mean,
well, it's certainly new. When I think back to when I came of age, a few years before you did, in terms of your background, you mentioned, Ronald Reagan was president. I was 12 when he first ran. I was in college by the time his second term was up. And I just think, you look record-wise in terms of what Ronald Reagan talked about and what he delivered on and what Donald Trump talked about and delivered on, very similar records on all but a few specific issues. But there was just this larger sense of optimism that I think as a young person I was drawn to. People forget Ronald Reagan carried the 18 to 29-year-old vote in his re-election, for sure. That was big. But he came close to carrying it in the first election in 1980, which was not a given. And so crazy, I obviously I applaud President Trump for what was accomplished during his tenure. I think it was remarkable, particularly those first 2 years. But I do think in general for Americans, but specifically for younger people, not just college, but even those high school and younger, if we're going to capture, at least have a play, you look at battleground states like mine, last November, part of the reason we didn't have the massive red wave was because we got slaughtered. I mean, in some cases by 40-point margins in Pennsylvania and Arizona and Wisconsin, in other key states and some of those key statewide races for the Senate and governor. I think part of that's certainly early levels of liberal indoctrination, but part of it as well to bring them back in, to at least give them
they've got to like us.
Right, you got to point out, hey, we love America. That's what I say all the time on campus talking to students. The left wants to divide you. If they don't agree with you, you and I have both been targets. You're transphobic, you're homophobic, you're racist, you're sexist. Doesn't matter what the issue is. That's what they call you. Yeah. And I said, no, we believe as conservatives that I don't care whether you're black or white, rich or poor, young or old, whether you were born here, you came here legally from somewhere else. We believe that everyone in America should have access to the same freedoms and opportunities that you and I inherited from past generations. That's what you and others in the military fought for, and we should be proud of that.
Well, there's not that many organizations. YAF is one of them, but there's not that many. There's not even many politicians. I like to think I'm one of them. That really explain what conservatism is and like what we're trying to conserve exactly. And it is those founding ideals. That was the first thing I told your group. I call it your group because you're head of YAF, and I was talking to a YAF group at Catholic University last night. Because they asked about what's the conservative view of foreign policy. And I was like, well, let's start with what conservatism is.
Right.
It's not obvious that there's like a conservative foreign policy, right? Because that's a complicated question, but it's an interesting one. But you got to start with what conservatism is, and I would largely define it as you're conserving the founding principles, which means a lot of things that we can get into. But before I get sidetracked on the issues of philosophy, which I often do, you mentioned us being able to win in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, and you being from Wisconsin, and you being a person who has won in a state like Wisconsin, because you're a Republican, and you've won in a place like Wisconsin.
3 times, yeah.
We're not winning in Wisconsin.
Not right now.
Not at the moment.
Or Pennsylvania. The last couple elections, yeah.
Michigan's like, God, it feels like a lost cause at this point, but Trump won it at one point, so it can't. These people haven't changed that much.
Right.
What's going on from your point of view? Are we just not likable? I mean, politics often is that simple.
Yeah, it's a combination of things. It's some cases it's candidate recruitment, finding the right candidates. Some cases it's financial. I mean, one of the huge disadvantages we've had in the industrial Midwest is, liberals have used President Trump as a beacon to bring dollars in, right or wrong on his part. It's become a reality, and it's back to that age factor that you've just seen such a shift. When I won my last re-election, I took 47% of the 18 to 29-year vote. The last guy who ran for governor last November lost that vote by 30 points. You just can't make up those margins. The other factor is, and this is one of the untold stories, again, about the supposed red wave last year. There was a red wave. It was in governors. Republican governors, right. Every single one of them
crushed
from even in Vermont.
And what's the
Bernie
thing
Sanders.
that ties all these governors together?
The kicker is
they like to govern. They're boring. They're not crazy.
Well, they're proven problem solvers.
They're proven problem solvers.
The other big thing is, and Tommy Thompson, who is one of my mentors, said elections are always about the future. They're never about the past. Mm-hmm. Difference, I believe, with Republican governors was they not only were proven problem solvers, they had an agenda, they had a plan, they had a vision to move forward. Unfortunately, a lot of the candidates, because of the primaries that went through and the things that were said and done during that, they were viewed as people who were looking backwards. No matter what you think about the last election, to swing voters,
without
like the
saying
ones
names, we know exactly who we're talking
for
about.
swing voters to win in a state like mine, you can't win with Republicans. You can't win with conservatives alone. You got to swing independents. And
how are you going to make my life better? How is life going to be better? And another thing I don't like about populist Republicans is they just take the playbook of the left. So what the left does is say, I'm going to make your life better by giving you this. You're going to get your child tax credit's going to be doubled. It's like, hey, that was a Republican idea, by the way. But we have limiting principles. We know you can't just infinitely increase these kind of benefits. Democrats say, well, we're just going to increase your Social Security payments because we want old people to vote for us. Republicans are like, well, we actually need to save that program. Like, oh, they want to cut it. So it becomes a bribery game. Yeah. And my message always to a lot of our far right populists is don't play the bribery game with voters. You can't win. You'll never be able to outbribe the Democrats. It's like trying to out subsidize China. Like you can't play their game. It just doesn't work. You've got to promise people the challenge of freedom, which is liberating.
And there's the kicker is that's the part, that's the best selling. I said, I'm all for free stuff, not Bernie Sanders or AOC's free stuff, not free tuition, not free this. I'm all for freedom, free enterprise, free speech, free assembly. Those are the things that are worth fighting for. And those are the things that are everlasting. One of a great bit of optimism, I'll tell you a story. So about 3 years ago, right when COVID shut everything down, I was not president of Young America's Foundation, but I was asked by the then president to speak at a number of campuses, Cornell and all these easy campuses, right? So the last one I was at was Stanford. Great campus. Yeah, I had some protesters, but I kind of look and say I had 100,000 protesters. A couple hundred don't bother me. But after I was done, I asked the 3 students who organized it who they were, what little background. And one of the 3 was really intriguing to me. I said, how'd you become a conservative? He said, well, it wasn't because of what most people do. His parents are both liberals. Mm-hmm. I said, well, how'd you become that? Well, he was listening to the radio one day when he was in high school in his parents' vehicle. He's all by himself, flips through the radio, finds a voice, it happened to be Rush Limbaugh, and he loved listening to this guy. And because he loved it, he would keep going back to it when he was by himself, and he'd read the books, he'd read the articles.
Interesting.
So he comes to Stanford. He's a full-blooded conservative. I mean, just the right kind, exactly the kind you'd want. This guy didn't get it by osmosis. He didn't get it by just showing up at a rally.
Yeah.
Well, the cool part about that story is not just that it can happen. This guy, John, is the son of Susan Rice. Ooh. John Rice Cameron is a full-blooded conservative. What I love about it is what you were just alluding to. He understands that true freedom and prosperity, they don't come from the clumsy hand of the government. Yeah. They come from empowering people to live their own lives and control their own destinies through the dignity of hard work. That's a compelling message. And that's why the left doesn't want, that's why they push cancel culture. They don't want guys like John, despite what he heard in his household, to hear the truth.
I assume they're out with this and we're okay with publishing that fact.
Actually, I'll tell you one more funny thing. So not only is it out with it, but remember last November when then Joe Biden's chief of staff tweeted that image of here are the things to counter your crazy uncle with, meaning all of us who don't necessarily agree with them.
Yeah. I tweet out the same things.
She retweeted it and said, or your son. Which I thought as a parent is a little bit odd, but
kind of funny.
So I emailed John and was like, happy Thanksgiving. We got your
Good luck,
back,
buddy.
Yeah,
good
but
for
he's
him.
still a conservative. Works actually in Houston in finance.
Oh, really? Oh, shit.
Great guy.
You often see that because there is sort of a natural rebellion against your parents, right? So very conservative parents often, a lot of my supporters are like, my kids are so liberal. What are you doing? I'm like, I don't know. Send them to my podcast. I think it'll help them. And it often does, actually.
Well, it does. That's part of the fun with as you know, as you did just a speech last night for us. One of the things we love the most about our lectures aren't the lecture, it's the Q&A, it's the interaction. Yeah. And I think most students are kind of what you alluded to years ago. They're not as radical as we think. Yeah. It's just the radical ones get all the attention.
Yeah.
When the curious ones show up, in fact, sometimes the protests actually help us. Yeah. That's why we've got more than 1 million subscribers on our YAF TV on YouTube, because people want to see that and they're curious, so they show up. And if we have a few protests, that helps. But most kids, they're just trying to figure out how to get to class, what their friends are doing over the weekend.
Yeah, that's
and
mostly what
right now they're intimidated to speak out. But suddenly they hear someone like you, they hear someone like Ben Shapiro, others out there, and they go, that actually kind of makes sense.
Yeah, and if there's going to be a show, well, maybe they'll come by instead of So
what's all the fuss about?
Right. I mean, guys like Ben, that's what made him famous, right? Those interactions publicly.
And the calm, the thing that...
It's fact-based, yeah.
Right. Sometimes people don't get... You mentioned some of the others in media outlets and radio and elsewhere, particularly in social media. The interesting thing is, and Ben's really kind of perfected it, but almost all of our speakers take this route where they spend about half or more of their time on Q&A, often allowing people who disagree with them to raise their hand and go to the front of the line.
Yeah.
But they're not screaming at them.
Right.
Usually, even if our videos say they're owning a lib on this or that, it's not because they screamed at them.
Yeah, it's owning.
It's because they're like, hey,
facts and reason.
Okay, that's great, but
rhetorical questions.
We don't let a 19-year-old swim against a 10-year-old. So why does it make sense for someone who was born biologically one way to swim against somebody else? It's an inherent disadvantage.
It actually makes me angry that that topics like that take up most of our time on college campuses, because it's so stupid. We shouldn't be having that conversation.
Well, they're missing the bigger. As you know, the economy is in total disarray.
Right.
We're handing over more and more control to the government, taking it less away from entrepreneurs like these
problems.
Kids, many of whom are going to develop the next great business, the next great opportunity. But instead, they're
obsessing over this.
Social issues, not just transgenderism, but abortion and things that have very minimal impact on their lives, the things that will affect their future.
And we have to address them. Don't get me wrong. We have to address them because the left is pushing it. And it's like, why? Why do men need to swim with women? Why do they need to be in their locker rooms? Like, there is... I just my last podcast guest was Riley Gaines, and we dove into that pretty heavy. But it's just it's beneath our politics. I was thinking of a way to post this respectfully about Jerry Springer, and I couldn't find one, but I can say it respectfully. Jerry Springer is an interesting guy. He brought what America wanted, which was mindless conflict to entertainment television, right? Just
was Twitter before Twitter.
The crazy conflicts that people just want to watch, and they just like want to take out the popcorn. And I'm like, but you know what he also did? He kept it away from politics. Yeah. People could go there and do that thing, and then they could go to a sporting match and like do that thing, and then they could vote. It was all separate. Now the Jerry Springer Show is our politics. If you like watch clips of that, you're like, that kind of seems like politics. But in many ways, both in the physicality of the disagreements that oftentimes happen. Sometimes, I guess that's been happening for a long time. There's blood on the steps of the Capitol from people shooting each other. So that's been going on for a while. But what I would actually point to is the kind of the anti-intellectual debate that would occur on a Jerry Springer show. And it's funny when it's on a Jerry Springer show, but it's not so funny when it's like part of our actual national political discussion on whether we should literally allow men into a women's locker room. That's a waste of my time that I have to. So I've spent so much time debating that. Right. I shouldn't have to. That's crazy.
Particularly because just a few years ago, it wasn't even on the radar.
It wasn't even on the freaking radar. And like the borders, maybe another issue. There was much wider agreement on how a border should function. Mm-hmm. Now we have to have that discussion. So like this Overton window keeps expanding and expanding and expanding, and it's beneath us in many ways. Like we need to be solving problems of the future. I don't know, like if I go to kids, college age kids, I'm like, what really should matter to you is entitlement reform. And the fact that you're voting Democrat is the stupidest thing you can make for your future. Stupidest decision. because you're ensuring that you'll never solve this problem. And trust me, you're not going to get what you think you're going to get.
And if they're worried about college debt, they're inheriting a debt far, far greater than any student loans that they have. But nobody really wants, or few people, not nobody,
and
few
Democrats
want to
tell
talk about
them what
that.
they're going to do about it. The Democrat plan for saving entitlements is simply raising taxes. So how do our young people not understand that Democrats are telling them very directly, we're raising your taxes and we're transferring that money directly to your grandparents because we think they vote more than you do? It's literally what Democrats are saying. And young people still fall for it. And so those are the kind of conversations, but those aren't flashy conversations. Kids don't care about that. I had like one kid interrupt me in the hallway here once being like, but it was from the left. And it was like, and he was like yelling, why do you want to cut my Social Security? And I was like, what is wrong with you, dude? Like
you're not getting it.
I'm on your side here. I'm trying to fight to save this stuff in a responsible way because I'm part of this generation that's going to get screwed here. We've got a lot of work to do.
Oftentimes, part of our challenge, I think, as conservatives at all ages, is we think and talk with our head. The left thinks and talks with their heart. We should never leave the logic of our mind, but find ways to tell it from the heart, or at least tell it in story form. It's why, again, many of our most powerful speakers are people like Yeonmi Park, who came from North Korea, or got a speaker I was just talking to yesterday from Venezuela or Cuba or other places out there, because they can match the reality of the personal experience with that, or sometimes just examples. You talk about students, talking about tax policy. Someone asked me, why I liked Reagan so much, and I said, well, amongst many things, not only was his optimism, but for example, I explained to him, I said, well, imagine, I pay you $1,000 for a job while you're in college, and now I take $700 of that back. And the reaction is, well, that's not fair. And, somebody else might say,
facts in a
why
way.
would I even want to work? I said, you get it. That's what the tax rate was before Reagan signed the largest tax cut in American history. It wasn't because of some, economist or accountant. That was just a reality that if you take that much away, why will people work? Why would they reinvest? But sometimes you have to explain it in ways that are real. The left is really good at that, oftentimes misleading or lying outright. But we've got to be better at explaining it in ways that immediately sink in, you don't have to be an accountant to understand.
Yeah, he was an expert at that. We haven't had one like that in a long time, but he was an expert at articulating the facts in a way that is very compelling and understandable. Thomas Sowell does it very well too.
Yes.
Like anybody who reads a Thomas Sowell book, it's packed with data, but it's presented in a way that is highly accurate and highly intelligible, and you can remember it. And it's like, whoa, that particular sentence just sticks with you. Similar to what you said. It's like, do you think it's fair or ethical to work 6 months out of the year for the government? Because that's what a 50% tax rate is. Right. Like, how is that ethical? It just makes people think, and Reagan was so good at that. Can we talk about you a little bit more on your general history?
Sure.
Because it's interesting, and I want to get into that. You got into politics at 22. What the hell, man? So you want a seat in Wisconsin State Assembly at 22?
Well, when I was young, I always thought that I would go into business. Loved business, but I was a history geek. I always thought of the founders of this country like superheroes, but was good in civics, good in social studies, but thought I'd go into business. I had the honor when I was in high school, my senior year, going to Boys State, and eventually came out here to go to Boys Nation, and it just opened my eyes, transformed my interest. But I didn't go into it right away. In college, I worked at IBM for a while. Got thrown into running for the legislature and eventually won a seat in a real close suburb of Milwaukee, which was a relatively competitive district when I was in my 20s. Served there for a while, thought I'd be done after 8 years. There was a big scandal in my county, Milwaukee County, the largest county in the state. County, it's about 2.5, 3 to 1 Democrat. But I said something unusual in politics. I just boldly said what I was going to do. In fact, I had these cards I handed out in that campaign that said, put this up on your refrigerator, hold me accountable. This is what I'm going to do in my first 30 days. And to this day, people still tell me they have that up in their fridge.
At 22, you had that kind of instinct.
Well, we just knew that people, throughout the years, whether it was in the legislature, county executive, eventually as governor, that, people are tired of the BS. They want people who tell you what they're going to do.
What were some of the issues you were running on?
When I first ran for the legislature, it certainly was welfare reform was a big deal. I helped Tommy Thompson expand school choice opportunities statewide.
At 22 years old. I got 20. Okay.
That's when I was in my 20s.
Okay.
And we were working with Governor Thompson on that. And I had actually...
You were a very well-informed 22-year-old.
What I found is instead of being active in college Republicans, which I was, instead of going to parties and hanging out, I actually went and helped candidates. And as you know, with a congressional campaign, even more at the state level, state legislative candidates, even today, hardly anybody helps them out. Yeah, so when I would help others out before I ran, it really gave me a chance to...
You were in it.
Yeah, say, not only help, but say, well, why do you have this belief? Why do you have this understanding? Why are you pushing this? And start being inquisitive about it and rose to the ranks.
I went to parties.
Yeah.
So
I did put some partying too, but
I did, but like I said, I wasn't really political. I wanted to be in the military. I just wanted to be a SEAL. That's all I cared about.
It's pretty awesome.
But I'm just fascinated by somebody who gets in politics that young, but also does it successfully. Because if a 22-year-old comes up to me and says they want to run, I'm going to say, don't run.
Right.
Without knowing anything about them, I'm just going to say, don't run. Now there are things I could find out about them that would make me say, okay, maybe. But, the reality is we don't have a great track record with people that age. So I just find your story kind of fascinating and that you've been successful on it and that you really knew the issues and you had a reason to run. I always tell people too, if they want to run, I say, okay, fine, you want to run, but you need to know why. And they're
100%.
Like, and they're like, well, I want to serve. And I'm like, shut up. Don't tell me that. That's not a real reason. I want to know what you want to do.
Yep.
Not what you want to be. Not that you want to be a legislator, you want to be the president. I don't care.
Yeah.
Like that's not a good selling point. I don't care that everybody wants to serve.
Right.
Okay. What do you want to do? And so you had that. You were like, I'm going to do these things. And that do could be a lot of things. It could be an issue. It could be a philosophy. It could be fighting, whatever. Like, but you need to know it so well that when somebody asks you, you're just like, it just comes out of you. Like it just comes out of you in 30 seconds. And you're like, oh, okay, that's why you're running. Interesting.
Well, particularly because, and you see it in this town, we see it across the country, particularly in Washington. I say more than conservative, liberal, Republican, and Democrat, there's two kinds of people here and in politics in general. People want to be somebody great. People want to do something great. I say be the latter. Whoever you are, wherever you're at, be the latter. Be there because there's something that needs to be done and you're in a position to make that happen. If you do that well, maybe, people will consider that great along the way. But there's far too many people, like you said, at any age, particularly younger, but at any age, who go in because they want to be somebody great. That's the wrong reason to be in public service.
And like be there when you're ready too, because I have this conversation a lot with high school students and whether I'm talking about a YAF, political event. But one thing I enjoy the most is just on my official capacity going to local high schools because they're kind of forced to be in the room.
Yeah.
So like they have an assembly and that's where it gets interesting because now you're dealing with people who would never really go to a political event. Doesn't mean they're not interested in it, but it's just they wouldn't go seek it out.
Right.
Same with like town halls. You can do a town hall, and I can post about it and everything, but who's going to show up? The political activists from either side. Just honestly, just the people who want to yell at me. That's really who wants to show
either way,
up.
Right.
And so I like going to like a large factory or business where like you just put everybody in a room and they're like, okay, like what's up? Who are you again? And then because they have real questions, and they're authentic.
Yeah,
they don't have an angle with their questions.
I love the factories particularly because you could watch the people up front were the more engaged. So I would always watch not only them but the people in the back because they usually would sit there with their arms crossed.
Yeah, they're like, what are we doing here? They're like, I'm annoyed. Who's this politician?
But by the end, as you were talking about things, if you could, that was always my test. If you could make them engage, if you could make them be drawn into the conversation. Yeah.
And they always have the best questions, honestly, because maybe they're not a good educated question, but they don't have an angle.
Right.
They don't have some agenda behind their question, like often people do.
Well, and usually where I found, particularly at factories, but across the board, was talking about some of the stuff you guys even worked on this week here, which I applaud you on, putting reasonable work requirements on people getting public assistance.
It should be obvious.
I always said, the line I used to say a lot, came up with out of the blue, but I've repeated is public assistance should be more like a trampoline and less like a hammock. Yeah. I want to help you. But if you're able-bodied, if you're working age, you shouldn't be there forever. And the guy in the back, usually at that point, that was like, yes, I agree with that. I'm working hard.
Anyone who's working agrees with that.
Well, and they don't mind helping others. It's not that we're heartless.
Yeah.
If you're down and out, we used to, when I was governor, we'd put work requirements in, but we'd even tie provisions in. We tripled the amount of money we had, for example, for alcohol and drug abuse addiction treatment.
Yeah.
So I said, I'll treat you, but you're not getting assistance if you're working age and able-bodied unless you're either worker training, working, or in some sort of rehab.
What do you think? We got a homeless problem in this country, especially in your more liberal cities, of course, because they sort of sanctify it, right? It's allowed. I mean, this is the truth be told. Look, if you lose your job and things are really bad for you, you don't end up on Skid Row under a bridge. That's not where you go.
No, there's so many support systems, not only in government, but just in general.
There's a lot. You end up there because you're mentally ill or you're addicted to drugs or you're just a weirdo vagabond, and there is kind of some of those types, but it depends on where you're at. San Francisco has those. Austin has those. Like, they're like young, able-bodied men that are just like, this is cool. They'll grow out of it. We got rid of our state institutions because of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I guess. I don't know. I'm not an expert on this history, but you were a governor for many years. I mean, at what point do we have that conversation about forced commitment? I mean, involuntary commitment to an institution because you cannot care for yourself. And like, how do we go about that? Do we create areas that we actually force, don't ask them to go there, but we make them go there. We have treatments. We've done things like this in Texas. Our governor has, but it was a one-time thing. Right. And I'm not an expert on the history of it. Maybe that'd be a different episode. What do you think about all that?
Well, I think there definitely has to be changes out there. We made some when I was governor. Obviously, we don't have as big of an issue because of the obvious fact that for part of the year, exactly. It gets warmer later, but for 3 or 4 months, you definitely don't want to be there. But the difference, other than
what is warm to you? Just to be clear, like what is warm in Wisconsin?
On my lake in Wisconsin, we get 85, 90-degree days in the summer, pretty
like
routinely.
A week or okay.
We get them pretty much June, July, and August are pretty good. Late June, July, and August.
That's good.
The nice thing about Wisconsin is we get all 4 seasons.
I love that. I feel like we do in Texas too, kind of different.
You get a bit of it, yeah.
I love my warm weather. I'm not going to lie.
I'm with the older
I don't want to drain my pool.
The older I get, the more I like that. I like it around Christmas and January. By late February, I'm kind of done with the snow and the ice. But homelessness, you're 100% right. And we see it not only in my state, but we see it, for example, on the outskirts, but not too far away in Santa Barbara, where the Reagan Ranch Center is at. We certainly see it in San Francisco and Los Angeles. It's a combination of things. Like in those states, particularly in California, those communities.
It's almost like they encourage it.
Yeah, they totally, and they won't do anything about it. Yeah. I mean, not a thing about it. So that's, if any of us are parents know, it's human nature. If you let people, even your own kids, if you let them keep doing things, they're going to keep doing them. But if you say, no, here are the rules, here are the guidelines, they're going to live up to that.
Well, you do that if you care about them. You do that if you care about them. And I tell those people all the time, like, I think we should treat the American people like we love them, like we love our, like, so if you hate your kids, what would you do? You would tell your kids that the rules don't matter,
right?
That every time they get in trouble, it's actually not their fault. It's someone else's fault. That every bad grade they get is the teacher's fault. It's not your fault. No consequences, no limitations on your behavior. You want to believe you're a cow today? You're a cow. You want to believe you're a girl or a boy, whatever, and somewhere in between today? Totally. Just affirm and you let anything go. Thing.
Well, even beyond, I'll get back to, I'm not avoiding your homelessness, but to go off of that point for a second.
It's the exact same point.
But it ties all together. Exactly right.
I think my point is we should treat the American people like we love them.
Totally.
Like they're our children.
Well, the last few years under the COVID shutdowns and everything else happened there, you see not only the shutdowns, but you see with kids for years, not teaching American history, not having any real responsibility, not having any requirements. There's no resilience. One of the biggest problems youth have today is nobody's ever taught them that, you know what, America's gone through some pretty crappy times and we've made it. And you look at all the world wars, everything we've gone through, the Great Depression, we made it. Doesn't mean these aren't challenging times. And I think that's part of it for your question about homelessness. It's the reality is there's many people out there that are suffering from alcohol and drug abuse, and they've gone to the point where it's taken them into a homeless situation. They don't have to be. Yeah. And we've got to say, we'll help you, but you've got to take treatment. We'll help you when it comes to mental health issues.
But again, the question is, do we force it? Like we used to. And I think so I'll just say my opinion. Like I'm at the point where I think yes, because there are people who are so far gone, they're a danger to themselds, they're a danger to the society.
Even some of the violence issues we see around the country have tied into that too, that we just ignore them.
Issue. You can't allow people to live that way. Like we're at a point now where we can develop a specific community, develop tiny homes made out of, whatever. Like this is not a hard problem to solve. Again, we've sort of done it in various moments in Texas. Make sure there's resources there. This is a humane way to deal with this problem.
Right.
Some people can never leave that place. Like they're just not capable.
Right.
They'll kill themselves or they'll kill others. It's not, we don't have the resources anymore the way we used to at the state level. Maybe because there was abuses, maybe because the practices were very terrible. I got it. And there's a lot of terrible movies made about it. But we
can go back to that. But you even know here in D.C., it's not Texas, not California, so it's not because of the warm factor. But there's certain spots in this town, not too far from this capital, where it's like cities. It's like little enclaves, and it just makes no sense. It's not sanitary. It's not safe. I live in Capitol Hill.
Like there's 10 cities under that bridge. They're nice. They're nice people. They have they have artwork outside their tents. It's odd, but
it's also indicative though of years of liberal policies. It's kind of like interesting connection. So I wrote last week in the Washington Times in my weekly column about how ironic it is the DNC picked Chicago to be their convention city. It's up the way Milwaukee's going to be where this RNC is, but Chicago's probably perfect for the DNC because it shows you what years of horrible liberal policies. Crime's out of control. The schools are a mess. Businesses, Ken Griffin took Citadel and left. You've got all these other companies are leaving. Why? Because it's a mess. It's an absolute mess, and it's for no other reason other than liberal failed policies that just don't work. And the new mayor is even worse than the last mayor.
Yeah.
And when these kids are holding a riot a couple weekends ago, he's saying, well, we can't demonize them. Well, one, we can do something about it. And two, it's not just their fault. It's the city leaders' fault for having, places where the schools are constantly shut down, where the unions run things, don't actually teach the kids about education, are more interested in having them be involved in protests than actually getting a quality education, where the police force has been so villainized, it's out of control. These are indicative of kind of the world we live in under, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and leaders like people we've had in a lot of these big cities, including Austin in your state.
It is. In the end, it's the voters who vote for them.
Yes.
And that's an enigma. We don't have time to figure out that enigma. That's what politics is and elections is trying to figure that out. Why you're making the decision you're making, and we'll talk about that forever. I still want to talk about you a little bit more.
Oh, sorry.
So governor for multiple terms. You mentioned something a second ago that I caught on to, and I think I knew what you were talking about. You said you had a couple hundred protesters in Stanford, but you dealt with 100,000.
Right.
What was that all about?
Well, it was simple. People say it's unions, collective bargaining. That was all the technical side of it. Fundamentally, what we did.
What year is this?
This was 2001. So right after I first took office, we immediately took action because we had an economic and a fiscal crisis. So we took action literally in the first days of our time in office. We had flipped everything. Everything was Democrat controlled before we came in. We flipped the Assembly, flipped the State Senate, flipped actually the House representation and one of our U.S. senators as well. But we came in and we knew we had to take action. And I was so eager to fix things I didn't talk about anymore. I just went out and did it. The left went crazy. The unions went wild. But what we did was take power out of the hands of the big government union bosses and put it firmly in the hands of the taxpayers and the people they duly elect. So instead of school boards, being run by a couple of union bosses, now the people you elect to be on your school board actually make those decisions. Not only did it help us balance our budget, which we did 8 years in a row, we had surpluses. We saved almost $16 billion since that time for state and local governments. But I think more importantly, we got rid of tenure and seniority. So schools and local government, state government now can staff based on merit. They can pay based on performance. That means like in a school, they can put the best and the brightest in the classroom and keep them there. It's had a fundamental difference out there. And it's why the left reacted such as they did, because that's their power base. Forced unionization, forced benefits, all these things that are, as I mentioned, Chicago are tearing school districts and cities like that apart.
Yeah.
We've fundamentally changed, and the left's been angry ever since.
Yeah, they sure have. But they did a lot. Their anger manifested in a very specific way some sort of like insurrection, some people might call it.
They took over our state capital, not for a couple hours. They literally, for almost a month,
1 month,
took a seize of the Capitol. Mark Thiessen, who writes for the Washington Post and appears on Fox, wrote an interesting column after January 6th the next week. He said Democrats were for occupying a Capitol before they were against it. He was referencing what happened in Wisconsin, where literally Pelosi and others were out egging these people on, to unlawfully not leave the Capitol. I said it was the Occupy movement before Occupy Wall Street. It started in my street. And the reality is that we hung firm. The intention, not unlike a lot of these college students I talk about, they may not have 100,000 protesters in a classroom, but it's all about intimidation. They want to intimidate any of us who dare try to raise any sort of common sense, particularly that challenges their underlying power structure. We did, and it's still working. Yeah.
It turns out the sky didn't fall.
Well, we had a recall election, so they were so upset. I became the first governor in American history to successfully navigate a recall election with more votes and a higher percentage of the vote. Why? Because it actually worked. There was, I think in 2012, there were 11% of the electorate that voted for me and voted for Barack Obama. It makes no political sense whatsoever. But they were swing voters who said, hey, the guy did what he said he was going to do. And I think that's part of our challenge as conservatives. It's just do it.
Yeah. Eddie, when states like this, there's a lot of these swing voters, there's a lot of these independent voters in my district, my old district, in Texas too, which is just kind of surrounds a lot of Houston suburbs. Yeah. And this is the story of all suburbs. Trump won it by 1 point. I won it by like 14. That was the case across a lot of suburbs. So there's a lot of swing voters. There's even more swing voters, independently minded voters in places like your state, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. What are they looking for? Is it just? It seems to me. So I do know what they're not looking for. Like I know the polling. I know the focus groups. I mean, if you say MAGA, they don't like it. Like, I'm sorry to anyone that offends. It's just true. Okay, I'm not saying I don't like MAGA. Like, I'll wear your MAGA hat. I'm a Republican through and through. But they don't. Okay, so that's just a fact. What do we do about it? And like, how do you get them to our side? And what are they persuaded by? Or is it? And that's the thing about independence, is it just different for every individual?
Right. I think one of the interesting things historically, and we defied this in Wisconsin, particularly in that recall election, is the way you win swing voters is not necessarily becoming moderate. It's how you govern. So I mentioned before Republican governors, I tried to do this as well. If you're a proven problem solver, people don't like fighters unless they think they're fighting for them. I mean, I think they think some people on the right and on the left are fighting for the sake of the fight. We see a lot of that on Twitter and social media.
Fighting for attention.
Right, exactly. We see it with one of your neighbors down the way here. But if you're a problem solver and you're fighting for them, for their families, for hardworking people like them, that makes a huge difference.
Independent type voters notice that.
Yeah, and I always used to say, when I was talking to someone, like we were talking about in the factory, my image, even when I was on TV or on the radio, even if I was on Fox or talk radio or whatever, was I talked like I was talking to a family in Janesville, Wisconsin, which is near where I grew up, where the GM plant closed a few years before, where dad works at a factory, mom maybe is a nurse at the local hospital, 2 kids in the public schools there just trying to make ends meet. Yeah. They're not Republican, they're not Democrat, they're not wildly political, but they vote and they're involved in their community, they go to their church, and they just want someone to look them in the eye and say, I hear you, I get you, and here's what we're going to do to help make your life better. Not necessarily by another program. Many cases by just getting government out of the way, but it's not because there's some wild, rabid fight out there, but because we understand that's better for you. And I think we talk to people like grown-ups. We treat them, you mentioned the phrase before, love, like we love them, which we do. I mean, those of us who love America love Americans. I don't care what I particularly as governor, one of the great joys of being a governor, more than any other office, I think, and I love those of you who serve in the House and the Senate, but when you're governor, or before that was a county executive, you speak on behalf of everyone, even if they don't all vote for you. Yeah. There's something about being the chief executive, and that was always a powerful reminder to me that, and when I ran for president, one of the problems I had in the primaries was I'm moderate in tone, but not in action. Let me repeat that. I'm moderate in tone, but not in action. Because
you're a conservative, you're just not super angry about it.
Exactly. And I wasn't, I didn't call everybody I disagree with, evil, awful person. I might call them out when they do something wrong. But in the end, I had to be, as a governor, I had to look out for everyone. I'll give you an example. So years ago, remember when Obamacare was rolled out, they totally screwed it up, as we all predicted. We had 3 months. I was the only governor in America who didn't take the Medicaid expansion, didn't push for Obamacare, but never had one person, because of our reforms, living in poverty who wasn't covered under Medicaid. Now, when that expansion went through and they were all screwed up with the system, politically, I could have made a case and let everybody fall through the cracks. But I said, I love the people in my state too much that it wasn't their fault that Barack Obama and his administration screwed this up. Yeah, I predicted it'd be wrong, but I said, I'm not going to let them fall for the cracks. We're going to keep them covered. We eventually transitioned away from Obamacare, but we made sure that we didn't use that as a political trap to say gotcha on that, but rather said, no, people can't. These are still real people we have to deal with. Yeah. And that's
we
one of the things missing.
About healthcare policy and how Republicans need to message that differently. But
I would say take your phone out and tell people most Americans know more about their cell phone coverage. How many Zoom, how many minutes they have and everything else they've got than what their healthcare actually costs. Make it transparent, make it as viable as what you know with your cell phone plan, and we'd be a whole lot better off.
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. I can go real deep in that. Yeah. We are working on that in a wild way, but I want to kind of keep on the topic at hand, which is some things you mentioned. I want to dovetail off of those, which is, again, convincing independence. So the thing about these independents that you're talking about, this family that you're talking to, and this is how I see it too. I fully agree. I try to talk to that family. Mm-hmm. What makes our current politics hard is that family, they're not following you on Instagram. Right. They're not following you on Twitter. Right. They're not commenting. They're not fighting for you. Because they're just trying to live. There's normal, and that's most people. Mm-hmm. They're just trying to live. And, in person, I get it all the time, right? Like, thank you for sticking up for us. Thank you for being like somebody I can actually tell my friends that I support. And I'm like, thanks, man, but it'd be nice if you just went to my comment section and like hit back on some of these idiots from the right and the left. Mostly the right, to be perfectly honest, because like you said, one of your problems in the presidential election is you're not angry enough. And our primary voters have been conditioned to desire anger instead of winners. Mm-hmm. Something I talk about at every event that I ever do. I talk about what it means to win, what it means to fight for attention versus fighting for your actual values. And the Democrats are just better at strategizing on that front. Like they manipulate our elections. They allow their candidates to say things and like kind of lie a little bit, like pretend to be a little bit more moderate to get elected. Like their base allows them that space. Ours doesn't, right? It's like, no, you have to say the things. Well, why? I don't know. I don't care. I read it on Dan Bongino's page. And you're like, okay, but do you want to lose or do you want to win? Right? And in the end, we're all fighting for the exact same thing. I thought so anyway. So you've got to be smart and strategize about how you go about this. And so that's why I give that point at every speech I give, at every Lincoln Reagan dinner, whatever it is, and people get it. But it's not obvious that we're voting that way. Sometimes we do. The 2022 election is a mixed bag. Right. So we voted a lot of primary. We chose a lot of primary candidates that we never should have chosen. They had never had a chance of winning. And it's like we wanted to lose in some cases. I don't know how to change that within our own party, that mentality.
Well, we definitely have to push back, because what you saw in a number of those instances is the liberals have figured that out. They put money behind it.
Them with hundreds of millions of dollars.
For all these people who claimed, they were worried about being threatened by democracy, they went out of their way to support candidates that they claimed they were against. Yeah. So we've got to call that out, push that more so along the way.
I did a whole video on that. Like example by example, multiple states this happened where Democrats wanted to choose the candidate they wanted.
That's exactly.
And then they beat them.
Well, and even before that, you look in those special elections in Georgia, a part of their appeal was, Democrat groups were running billboards and other ads saying, why vote for these two senators? They're not standing up for pushing back on the 2020 election. Well,
Democrats ran those ads.
Democrats are running those
wild.
ads.
And it's like, damn it, people are to my own people. You've got to pay attention better.
The example I give with that is going forward, we've got to be more like Virginia and less like Georgia. What I mean by that is, and I think you have to give real life examples. You know, that's when people get, because they like Youngkin, they like whatever. They said, yeah, people had written off Virginia. They said the Commonwealth was dead. We were never going to win it back. It had gone completely deep blue, and it's unfortunately gone too far that way. But how did Glenn Youngkin win? He listened to the people. He didn't claim to run out in front of them. He ran with them. He listened to putting parents back in charge in particular. He empowered them. He engaged them with a lot of crazy things that were happening at the time. And then in that case, and I'll give credit to President Trump on this, in part because of the way Youngkin set his campaign up, but Trump encouraged his supporters to vote for him, but he didn't jump on it. He just said, go out and vote for him.
Didn't make it a MAGA election.
And he said, which I get, he said, hey, there are going to be problems. They're going to try and steal this election. That we got to flood the system was the phrase used. That means don't sit at home and complain about it. Flood the system. I mean, getting as many people as you can out to vote. And of course, Youngkin won. The contrast a year before that was, this is a mess. This is, stolen.
Yeah.
Well, people sat at home because they believed it.
Yeah.
We got to be more like Virginia going forward and less like Georgia. Doesn't mean you can't call out problems if they exist, for sure. But don't let that be a reason to sit at home and not engage.
I guarantee your vote doesn't count if you don't vote.
Exactly.
I guarantee it doesn't count. But that's a good way of putting it.
And everything we care for, we've seen, particularly during the first 2 years before you guys took the House over. You look at what a mess. I mean, thank God for people like Sinema and Manchin, things could be a lot worse in this country. And as you know, even with the balance, the counterbalance of the House, I still look, even though I'm not engaged in this like you are, but I look at international and foreign policy and still think it is a train wreck. Every day Joe Biden is commander-in-chief is a day that scares the bejeebus out of me, because you just don't know what this guy's going to do. Afghanistan, of course, being that withdrawal being, I think, on the verge of treasonous, what happened there.
Yeah, it was, we could talk a lot about that.
Yeah.
Sticking to you though, what's it like starting a presidential campaign? Maybe we're running out of time, so I have to ask, because not that many people do that. So
a handful of us.
What's that like? What surprised you? What was the initial conversations like? What's your day to day? What is this?
Yeah, the cool thing is, the upbeat side of this is, I got to tell you, a very positive thing was, and my wife and I both would tell you we enjoyed it, even though short-lived. I joke I got out before I got a nickname. There's a lot of things I pass on to my friends who are either in or about to be in this race now. But the cool thing was the people. We met so many amazing people, and I got to tell you, our accents are a little bit different. But whether you're in New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina, Iowa, people are so much alike. There's so much more that brings us together as Americans, concerned for their country, concerned for their neighbor, concerned certainly for their family. Just a lot of good and decent, honorable people in this country, and that
you only see that if you're campaigning on the ground.
You do,
if you live online.
Oh, totally.
God, you're gonna have a really bad view of
people
the
forget
world.
that Twitter. Literally, there's Pew Research points out every year that Twitter is less than a quarter of all Americans, and 80% of the tweets are done by 10% of the people on. So when something's trending, it's about 4 to 5% of the entire population. And yet the media, which is lazy, thinks that's America. It's not. You go out and people criticize the early primary and caucus states. I love it. These people in New Hampshire, Iowa, and the other states take it totally seriously. They're engaged. They ask you good questions. They're respectful. It should never change in that regard out there. But I just think there's a lot of benefit to it. So that part was exciting. The one big takeaway that I'd pass on to any of my friends who are running right now, at least on the Republican side, is again, as I said this before, elections are about the future. The biggest mistake I made 8 years ago was we had this great record. We were high up in the polls largely because people liked what we had done, that we were willing to take things on. Yeah, there's a few that wanted me to be more, angry and upset. But my biggest fault wasn't even that. It wasn't the rhetoric. It was that we ran our record instead of being as bold as we had been in all those elections before. I was bold when I ran as a young person in the legislature. I was really bold when I ran for Milwaukee County Executive, a county that was Democrat. I was bold when I ran for governor because it was a blue state. Mm-hmm. I should have been just as bold running for president. I look at, you pick the issues. Could have been a flat tax. Could have been this, that, whatever. We should have been just as bold. Instead of running on a record, we should have ran on what we were going to do next. And to Donald Trump's credit, he talked about a lot of the same things we did, and he did it obviously in ways that I wouldn't have, both in style and even some of the substance. But he took, whether it was the border or what was dealing with ISIS, he supersized it. He made it unique and big in his regard.
You knew what he stood for very simply.
And I said, if I have any advice to my friends who are running now, is you got to be bold. You can't just run on what you've done. Yeah. You got to clearly spell out what you're going to do and make it real for that family we mentioned in Janesville.
So, any more desires to get back into politics?
Well, I'm a quarter century younger than Joe Biden, so I got plenty of time.
You got a lot of time.
It is the benefit of being both glib and true at the same time.
Yeah.
But right now, I've said this repeatedly, but what we're doing right now at Young America's Foundation is so incredibly important. If we don't turn it around, by next year's election, 48.5% of the vote will be cast by millennials and Gen Z. 4 years later, the majority, by far, of the voters in America will be Gen Z and millennials. And if we don't turn it around with this generation, it won't matter. In a state like mine, it's done.
Yeah.
A guy like me, people that share our views will never be, or not anytime soon, be elected in our state. So what we're doing at Young America's Foundation, and if people are listening, if you're a student, hey, you're under attack, we got your back. If you're a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, a neighbor, we got programs for college, high school, now even middle school students. Mm-hmm. The biggest thing we hear from students, or just a little bit right of center even, is that they feel like they're the only ones out there. That's the goal of the left, is to intimidate.
Right.
Have them come to one of our conferences. We can open their eyes to some great speakers like yourself and others out there.
And kids listening can go to the Young America Foundation website, and if they don't have a chapter at their campus, they could start one. There's plenty of ways to do it.
And if they just want to watch, not only YAF.org, our website, but go on YouTube. Mm-hmm. We're now the #1 conservative youth organization on YouTube, almost 1.25 million subscribers. This last quarter, first quarter of 2023, we had over 250 million views on YouTube alone, almost 400 million total on all of our social media platforms. So what that tells me is young people are hungry. Yeah. They want to hear something other than what's being spoon-fed to them in their schools and their colleges, but we just got to do more of it.
I love it. Governor Scott Walker, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. My pleasure. Keep fighting for freedom.
We will.